Hello, welcome. My name is Sean Morgan. I'm glad you joined us today. This is our quarterly webinar series called The Themes of the New Economy. Again, my name is Sean Morgan, and I'm joined today by Reggie Smith. He's one of our research analysts here at Eventide, who focuses on energy. Just a little bit of background on Reggie. So before joining us at Eventide, Reggie spent many years at Johnson Controls, where he developed energy conservation and solar projects, and most recently, he led a development engineering for energy storage startup business within the firm. So Reggie also, educationally, he holds an MBA with high distinction from Harvard Business School and a bachelor's and master's degree in mechanical engineering from Drexel. Today, we will be talking about the history and future of energy. Notably, this is a very complex topic and it has also become very polarized. So this is my invitation to you on this call. I want to invite you to be curious with us. I encourage you to graciously engage all sides of the conversation. That's the attempt that we approach this with too. So read books from people like Alex Epstein and Mark Mills, as well as books by Vaclav Smil and Bill Gates. Be skeptical of anyone offering a flawless solution or the promise of a utopia. The more curious I've become, the more I have understood that there are informed arguments on both sides of this debate. So there are potential upsides and downsides of fossil fuels and potential upsides and downsides of renewables. So approach this conversation less like a lawyer who is hired to zealously defend a client, and approach it more like a juror willing to put every testimony through the same scrutiny. So what we hope to accomplish in this webinar is to help build a framework to help us understand how to evaluate the energy landscape. It's not a one-dimensional analysis. There are many factors to consider, and Reggie's only going to scratch the surface of a lot of these factors. So Reggie, go ahead and go to the disclosure slide, the next one. I want to make sure that we don't overstate or over-imply that we have an outsized or overwhelming exposure to clean and renewable energy. It is a theme within our portfolios, but even if you're skeptical about our conclusions on the theme, we believe that there's still a lot of room for agreement and partnership. So there will be many facts and figures in this presentation that we've pulled from third parties, but there are also many things that we will show and that we will say that are our own views and opinions and our own interpretations of the data, and there is no guarantee that those statements are true. So with that being said, Reggie, I'll turn it over to you and you can help us understand our energy landscape.
Absolutely, and Sean, thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be with you today to discuss this important topic. Just to maybe set the table a little before we get started, when we talk about energy, we're literally talking about the ability to survive and hopefully thrive here on planet Earth. Energy gives us the ability to cook, to heat, to produce, to move. It is necessary for human flourishing, and it's a critical need. And we recognize that regardless of the energy source, it's necessary for human flourishing. So with that being said, and with that mindset, let's dive into Energy 101. And we'll look at our energy sources. Okay, so on the left here are what we call typically fossil fuels: coal, oil, and natural gas. You're familiar with these. We put oil in our car to drive. And then on the right, I have what are sometimes considered cleaner sources of energy. Nuclear involves splitting atoms to produce heat that ultimately gives us power. Bio is the burning of wood. Hydro is harnessing the energy stored in water and moving water in a river. And then wind and sun, of course, are leveraging the power of the wind and sun, solar, to generate electricity. Now, this next slide shows where we get. So we have those sources, okay, of energy. This shows the relative proportion. So what are we using the most of? And you can see that the majority is coal, which is 26%, natural gas about 24%, and oil 31%. So 81% of our primary energy consumption comes from fossil fuels. Biomass is almost 9%. It's rather high because 3 billion people still use wood for cooking, and renewables are about 2%. All right. Now, before we go any further, it's important to recognize the role that fossil fuels have played and currently play in our lives. They've elevated our standards of living to unprecedented levels. They've unleashed the greatest worldwide economic prosperity in human history and have been essential for innovations for human thriving, from medicine to agriculture and transportation. Besides giving us electricity, and a lot of it, almost everything in our built environment, like steel, cement, and plastic, requires fossil fuel inputs. So while we're talking about renewable energy, and in some cases using less fossil fuels in the future, they'll continue to play a role, and we owe them much for our ability to survive on planet Earth. Now, we talked about sources, let's talk about uses. What are we using all this power for? So, or all this energy for, I should say. So one of the things we use all this energy for is power, or the electricity grid, actually getting electricity to your home. Okay, the other bucket is industrial applications, making stuff, transportation, moving around, and commercial buildings, right? We have to heat and cool buildings and make them suitable for occupancy. All right, now let's look at the largest sector. What sector of those 4 sectors is consuming the most energy? All right, and when you look at it here, the biggest one is power, right? That's the one that stands out to you. And this is when I say power, I mean the electricity grid, and that's the main chunk, 40%. Then we have for industry 16%, for transportation 18%, and for buildings 14%. Now you might notice the 7% for energy or non-energy use. You can think of that as materials. It's the fact that we need to use energy, things like oil, to make materials. They actually go into materials, like our clothing, for example. All right, so we have our energy sources on one hand, right? And then we have on the right, the energy uses, these 4 broad energy use categories. Now, let's look at transportation. And let's ask, what energy source do we want to use for transportation? Well, of course, we use oil. Why would we use oil? Well, because it's transportable, easy to move around, has a higher energy density than coal or wood, so we don't put coal or wood in our cars. And we also have a lot of it, so it's relatively cheap. Now, why wouldn't we use nuclear? Well, I don't think any of us want to drive around with a nuclear reactor in our car. So nuclear, now you might say, well, what about electric cars? Well, we don't have a lot of them yet, so that's why we're using oil, all right? So from this simple illustration, we can begin to see some of the main elements that determine the sources and uses of energy, right? And so abundance and availability, this is a big factor. Supply economics, if we have a lot of something, there's a better chance that it will be cheap. Energy density, generally we like higher energy densities because they take up less space. Efficiency, how well can we extract the energy from the source? That is a big deal. If you have a lot of something, but you can't get it, it's useless. Transportability, some sources we can move, others we can't. And then the application, this really matters. Now think back in the beginning of the pandemic when oil prices went negative, as pricing in of lockdowns and negative oil demand was happening in a rush. And so application really matters. And if oil demand goes up, prices can easily rise, right? And so all of these factors, application, transportability, et cetera, determine the price of a particular energy source. And so there's a combination of factors that are important that we have to consider that really dictate the energy we use and how we use it. All right. Now, I want to give you a historical example and how this is played out in history. The steam engine. The steam engine was perhaps the most influential development in the history of energy technology, right? It's credited with giving us the Industrial Revolution. It meant that we could get power anytime, anywhere. And of course, it was powered by coal, and we had lots of coal, and it was cheap. The way it works is pretty simple. You burn coal to create heat, and the heat creates steam, and the pressurized steam is used to move a piston. And that piston then is used to do crankshafts and gears to power mechanical tasks, okay? And so the steam train, of course, connected continents. But in a matter of years, it was phased out to the diesel engine. Why did that happen? The diesel internal combustion engine. Because the diesel engine was twice as efficient, more compact. Diesel is twice as energy dense as coal. And that meant that you could go longer distances without refueling, perfect for the application. And there was lower overall maintenance costs and lower total cost of ownership. So it was a clear winner. And so this is where you can see how these factors really determine what is the best source and use for our energy. All right. Now, let's go back to our slide here. We have energy sources and energy uses. And now I want to zoom in on power, and that's the 40% chunk. And what we're going to ask is, what are the sources that we should be using here? Okay, so we're at power, we're at electricity. All right. Now, before we go through that, let's look at how we get power today and what is called the grid. So when I say the grid, this is what I'm talking about, and this is helpful for us to imagine. So let's move from left to right. So first we have a power plant or a generation facility. This actually produces the electrons that go on the grid. It's usually the most expensive step in the whole process of getting us electricity. That power or electricity then makes its way to large transmission lines. They can go for hundreds of miles, and then eventually make their way to a local or regional distribution network. And this is typically what you pay at your house. For example, when you pay your electric bill, you're paying the distributor directly. And so generation, transmission, and distribution, those three elements are what really make up the power system and your power bill. So I want to then sort of take 7 of the energy sources and sort of compare them and see, for power, how well they stack up. Now, 1 is what I've ranked as the highest here. That's the best. And then 2 or 5, I should say, 5 is the worst, right? So we're going 1 to 5. All right. Now,
and I want to point out one thing real quick, Reggie, on this slide. It was an unintentional, and we pointed out we just didn't have time to change it before this, but I just want to make sure no one thinks we're giving anybody an unfair advantage here. So you'll notice the 2 under the wind column is green, and the 2s under hydro, nuclear, natural gas, and coal and oil are all yellow. That was unintentional. Is just a mistake. So anyway, those 2 should also be green, or light green.
Good catch there, Sean. Yeah. Yep. So if we work sort of from left to right again, and the major takeaway here is that there's no perfect power source, right? So coal is abundant, but pollutive. Oil might not take up a lot of land, but it's expensive relative to the others. Nuclear is reliable, but also very expensive. Natural gas is cheap and reliable, but we might not know how much we have, and it also causes some level of pollution. Hydro, you're limited by viable river locations. You need big rivers. It's impacted by droughts, but it's not pollutive. Wind and solar are very abundant and cheap, but they don't run when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing, and they use a lot of land. So when you see this and you see limitations in different technologies, these are really innovation opportunities. And of course, we're focused on renewables here. And that's what I've sort of highlighted here, this reliability and land use limitation. And I would encourage you to think of them as opportunities for innovation and for new, for progress to be made, and for investment and technology to sort of help solve some of these problems. And it really shows the strength of a diverse energy portfolio and how we really need that today. Now, I want to switch and show that 40%, where do we actually get our power from? So we compared, now let's look at where we actually do. And this is on a global level. And what it shows is, the bulk is 65% actually from fossil fuels, gas, coal, and a little bit of oil. Now, oil has been getting phased out on economic grounds to gas because it's 3 times more expensive per energy output. But we get quite a bit of nuclear and hydro, and some wind and solar. And wind and solar is the fastest growing globally. Okay, in 2020 it was 11%, projected to go to 56% in 2050. And why is this? That's really what we want to press into. Why is this sort of projection showing this explosion to 56%? And this is just a comment on this. This is the economic transition scenario, which means it is not based on any forcing from government to take fossil fuels down to zero by 2050. This is an economic transition. So if we look at it in the US, we see a very similar picture. We use a little bit more natural gas than the rest of the world, a little bit more nuclear, a little less hydro, and we have a little bit more solar and wind. We were at 12% in 2020, and we're going to 58% in 2050. So that story really is the same. Now, nuclear, I have here in this projection showing this going pretty low, almost to zero by 2050. That could change because of its reliable nature and non-pollutive characteristics. But this is the general economic transition. And you can see how coal continues to go down, largely replaced by renewables and natural gas. So I think it's important that we ask this big question. It's great. Renewables are supposed to increase, but so what, right? And I think it's important that we dive into maybe some of the hairy questions. Does that sound good to you, Sean?
I think it's important. We're already through the Q&A. A lot of people have questions as far as like, hey, I get it. Renewables are becoming more popular, but we're not quite convinced that they're good. So yeah, take us through some of these topics. I think you actually might cover a lot of these questions that we're receiving in your presentation.
Okay, sounds great. Let's dive right in. So we're going to look at these 5 factors. Okay, cost, right? How much is all this going to cost? What does it mean? Right? Energy usability. Can we actually use the wind and sun? And intermittency, that's a challenge. How do we overcome that? Or can we overcome that? Land use, right? Are we going to be swimming in solar panels everywhere? What are the impact of jobs and our economies? And what about supply chains and where we're going to make all this? And then, of course, the environmental impact. What does this mean for our ability to steward well the planet that we've been entrusted with? So let's start with cost. So Sean, there's something called the LCOE, okay? And what this is if you were to go out and build a power plant right now, regardless of the technology, it is the price that you would have to be paid for every megawatt hour of electricity that you produce to meet your required return, right? So your cost of equity. So it's essentially what you would have to be paid to do the project, okay? And it is a complete life cycle cost. So what we're saying here is, construction costs, operating and maintaining it, financing it, how much it's going to actually be able to run, right? So it's the all-in cost, and it really is powerful because it allows us to compare technology in an apples to apples way, right? Because these technologies are admittedly very different, right? Okay, so now I'm going to show what it is for the US. And boom, this is it right here. I'm going to work from left to right. Okay, and this is unsubsidized, so this is no government subsidies. So onshore wind is the cheapest. It comes in at $29 per megawatt hour at its lowest. Onshore wind is just wind turbines on the land. Tracking PV is when you build a solar plant and the panels actually move throughout the day with the sun to maximize the energy retention from the sun. And that equals, it's at 29 as well at its lowest point. Fixed axis PV, you just build the solar plant, maybe face all the panels south, and that's it, they don't move. Offshore wind, put the wind turbine in the ocean, offshore. CCGT, this is combined cycle gas turbine. This is what we have a lot of and have built out a lot of. It's when you fire up a gas turbine to spin a generator, and then you use the exhaust heat, cycle it back through another process to create steam, which then turns the turbine, the generator as well. So it's very efficient. Large hydro, if you were to find a big river that we could still use for hydro, that's what that is. CHP, very similar to combined cycle gas turbine. CHP, instead of taking the excess exhaust, like I said, and using it to turn the generator again, you actually just would use it to heat a building or produce hot water for your building, something like that. So universities will use it. Coal, notice coal is sort of on the right end of this spectrum. It's more expensive. And then nuclear, the most expensive here, all right? Now, I want to point out that I'm not even showing oil. And in the US, we wouldn't even consider oil for a power plant right now. And you might have heard arguments about wind and solar power, not being as energy dense as oil, and that's exactly right. Oil is a quadrillion times more energy dense than the sun. But energy density, remember, is only one factor. It turns out that if you got to build a building with a large turbine, complicated systems, and just pour gallons and gallons of oil into that system to create power, it can't even compete with coal or natural gas, yet alone the sun and the wind. And so lower cost options are just beating out the higher cost options. So, and the structural advantage that wind and solar have is free fuel. And in the long run, free fuel is tough to beat, right? And that's what we're seeing. In fact, in 2/3 of the world's population, we're only looking at the US here, but in 2/3 of the world's population, wind and solar are the cheapest way to produce electrons. 2/3 of the world. So, and these prices, of course, are going down. Now, before we leave this slide, a quick note, the ranges are because of location differences, right? So if you're in Arizona, you get a lot of sunlight. So you're going to be on the lower end of that dollar per kilowatt hour range. And then if you're in Pennsylvania, building natural gas, for example, where you have fracking going on in your backyard, of course, you'll have cheaper gas, right? So you'll be on the lower end, whereas other areas, might have a not as good as sun or not as easy access to natural gas. All right. So how did we get here? Because this was not always the case. This shows the rapid decline in solar costs, 80% declines in a decade. Okay. And Sean, there's something called Wright's law. It's a law of production. And it says, for every doubling of the capacity of production, costs should decline by a fixed amount. And for solar, what that has been, for solar modules, it's been 20%. So every time we deploy twice as much solar, costs drop 20%, right? And that's what's largely, you can see the gray here in this chart going down fairly quickly. And that's what that is. And the gray right here is the cost for solar modules. The all-in cost, like I said, went down 20%. And so when you're reading literature comparing the cost of traditional power plants to renewables, you got to look at the timestamp of whatever you're reading, because it might not be up to date, because these costs are always declining, right? They're most of the time, right? They're just going down. And so, if you're reading something from 2015, it's a very different story. All right. Now, the other major factor for this deployment is this, okay? And what this is the coal and nuclear replacement cycle. So all the power plants and coal and nuclear that we built 50, 60 years ago, they're being reevaluated. And a lot of them are being replaced, and they have to be replaced with something. And when power providers look at what they can build, in their place, should I build another nuclear plant, another coal plant? They're building wind and solar or natural gas, but a lot of it has been wind and solar. And so that's been driving the deployment of these new technologies as the prices have come down. So you see what's happening is, as our infrastructure is coming due, people are seeing the cheaper options and they're implementing them. All right. And this has been happening for quite a few years now. And just to calibrate you here from left to right, what this is showing is the gigawatt hours of coal and nuclear to be retired. Nuclear is in red, coal is in gray. And we've already done quite a bit of coal. There's another 215 or so gigawatts to be retired. Our entire grid is 1,200 gigawatts, right? So there's just this natural infrastructure replacement cycle happening here. Now, with all these things taken into account, I'm going to rate cost as a positive, and it's a low cost provider, or the lowest cost in many cases provider. So the cost fundamentals are really strong for renewables. All right, and let's move on then to energy usability and intermittency. Now, it's not going to surprise you that we get lots of sun and lots of wind, right? So I mentioned like 540,000 petajoules is what we use every year as humans. Well, the sun gives us 430,000 every day, right? And so if we assume that a solar panel is about 18% efficient, we can get 77,000 a day, and we only consume about 1,500 a day, right? So we have tons of sun to get the energy that we need, right? And for wind, it's similar. If we were to implement wind efficiently around the country where we can, we could increase our grid size by about a factor of 6, right? And we have plenty of leftover, okay? But capturing this is the challenge, right? So to battle intermittency, right? So we're talking about this challenge. We have plenty of it, but we have this intermittency challenge. We're looking to batteries, and batteries are getting cheaper. So the way batteries are used is to store the excess production on a sunny day or during high winds, and then to discharge it when power demand is high, but power production is low. And if you look at this for batteries, this is lithium-ion batteries. In 2010, prices were about $1,200 per kilowatt hour. In 2019, we were down to $156 per kilowatt hour. This looks a lot like the solar curve with Wright's law in full effect. And I mentioned the 20% for solar panels, well, it's 18% for batteries. So indeed, it is very similar. And so this is what we're starting to see be implemented, but you might be wondering, okay, well, let's factor in the cost of batteries to our LCOE curve, right? That's what we got to do now. All right, so let's look at that. Boom, here it is. So on the far right, I took our previous chart and just added onshore wind and storage and fixed axis PV and storage. And what you can see is something very interesting. So one, notice how it's very competitive with coal, right? And in some cases, it's clearly cheaper than a coal plant. Now, if we look at the median, if we think about the median in this chart compared to CCGT, or the main gas source, we notice that it's a little bit higher, okay? And so what this is telling us is that we can use energy storage for short-term, 4 hours or so duration, but we still need natural gas for longer periods of time, long duration, firm power. And so if anyone sort of says, well, we could just flip a switch and only use renewables, well, it's not actually economically feasible at the time. At this time, we still are going to need natural gas to firm up our grid in areas when even the storage can't come through for us, okay? Now, something that could be the long-term storage solution is hydrogen. So I want to look at that. Now, hydrogen today is used in oil refining and fertilizer production, and it's typically made from natural gas. So we actually use fossil fuels to make it. All right. Now, it could be used for renewables, like I said, and more likely probably to be used for long-term transportation. If you look at this chart, fossil fuel derived hydrogen is between $1 to $1.75 per kilogram, whereas today making it with renewables, which is leveraging electricity to make it, it's $2.50 to $4.50. So it's not, we can't do it that way. It's too expensive, right? But by 2050, it's projected to be cheaper, right? And the idea here is that as renewables continue to get cheaper, to make things with renewables will also be getting cheaper, all right? And so it would be sort of a hybrid fuel capable of being moved around like oil and gas. And it's actually already being used in forklifts in our warehouses that we now have all over the country for e-commerce, and large corporations are using it in their forklift stock hydrogen to power those. And we're looking at companies that are piloting this technology. All right. So let's rate energy use intermittency. Neutral. Well, look, we have tons of it. We can access it. It's really helpful, but we don't have all the intermittency problems solved. So we'll call it a neutral. We'll sort of call it a wash. Now, Sean, land use, this is an interesting one. And I'm wondering, are you concerned about the amount of land we're going to use?
Well, apparently I'm not the only one. A lot of people have asked questions about land use and the amount of land that particularly solar panels take up. So, and it's a valid concern.
Yeah, no, it is. It definitely is a valid concern. And you might have seen, articles about this. So let's look at this. All right. All right. So let's go back to our projection. All right. And this is what we're working from. And let's ask, how much land would we need for this to happen? All right, this economic transition scenario. And here we go. So for solar, we would need essentially the size of the state of New Jersey, 8,500 square miles. And of course, when you build solar, there's not really much you can do with that land. Now, one thing to keep in mind is we will be able to put it in uninhabitable spaces, some deserts or other areas that we won't need for agriculture or anything like that. And then for wind, we're talking 220 square miles, about the size of the city of Chicago. Now, this is direct land use. That means it's the pole and base and like the road that you need to build to get to the turbine. So we're not accounting for the spread out nature of wind turbines, because you can do farming around the wind turbine. Like it's not land that sort of just you can't use, right? And often is the case that they're on farms and there's tons of farming that goes on around them. All right. Now, wouldn't it be really cool, Sean? Let's think. And one other thing to point out here. This is increasing the amount of solar we have by 13 times and the amount of wind we have by 3 times. So keep that in mind. It's a lot. Now, to put this in context, how much land do we use for fossil fuels today? Right? Let's see. This is it. It's about 2/3 the size of the state of New Jersey. So we already use a lot of land for energy, right? So yes, renewables are more, but energy is a land intensive activity. And what this is taking into account is, all the mining and fracking and power plants that we have for coal, oil, and gas, right? So just something to keep in mind to put that in perspective. I think that's helpful. So let's jump out and look at some things that are going to help us take care of land. Remember, I talked about innovation as opportunity. Well, the wind turbine sizes have been getting dramatically different. Sean, I was looking at it today, and a company has come out with a even larger than I have pictured here. Okay, so we're already beating this innovation curve. But this is where we started, 0.1 megawatt, and now we're easily over 2 megawatt. And what that means is, per sort of land area, we're getting more power, which is fantastic. That's what we want, right? Because a pole is a pole is a pole, and you can put whatever you want on the top of it to capture that wind, right? So that's really good news for innovation. And then if we sort of kind of rate this, and while we're seeing innovation, it will require more land use. So I went with negative here. And I think that's a fair assessment.
I think that's fair, at least for where we are right now, assuming no innovation in the size and strength of solar panels before we get out to 2050.
Yeah. And now this is a big one. And jobs and supply chain, we'll take our time as we work through this. There's a couple of key points here for this one. So, Sean, this is just something that is really important to me as I think about even my family, our history. So I actually come from a coal mining family. On my mom's side, They were Italian and Lebanese immigrants. I believe the Lebanese side, they were fleeing persecution in the Ottoman Empire at the time, over 100 years ago. And they came to the coal mines in Pennsylvania. Some of them died of black lung, and they really produced the coal that powered our nation, and largely their efforts contributed to the prosperity that we have today. And so any any conversation we have around energy, we have to talk about building good paying jobs. That has to be the focus in the present and the future in light of innovation, right? So what I have shown here is the direct jobs related to different energy sources. So with wind, almost 115,000, coal, 185. So we have roughly 55,000 or so miners, but then we have people working power plants and construction, et cetera. And then solar, a lot of construction jobs, natural gas, a lot in mining, et cetera. All right. So there's a lot of jobs in the energy industry. Now, one report by PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, said about 10.4 million jobs is the total impact of oil and gas. And it's the most sort of generous number you probably find, because it's direct jobs, it's indirect jobs, and then it's what all those people spend and the jobs they create by spending, right? So it's important. It's a big industry. And the challenge is, when you think about energy and shifts in technology and growing pieces of the energy supply chain, you're talking about location and labor mismatch, meaning we saw coal is expensive, and that's why it's declining. And so can coal miners go to the jobs now in building wind turbines? Is that near where they're at? It might not be, right? And so that's a challenge. Reskilling. If you've been working in coal your whole life, can you reskill in time to take advantage of these jobs, particularly if you're near the end of your career? And then pay rates. Fossil fuels are lucrative, right? And they pay well. Will these new jobs in other industries, other energy sources, industries, will those pay the same? Sometimes they don't, right? And that's another challenge. And then there is too few countries producing from soup to nuts, solar in particular. With wind, from a U.S. perspective, we have we're leaders in producing wind. In fact, we produce wind components in 43 states, employing thousands of people in manufacturing jobs. For solar, it's a little bit of a challenge. We only have 5 to 10% of the market. A lot of it, over 80%, is concentrated in China, and that's raised new issues around the integrity of the supply chain, particularly with forced labor. And some of our viewers might have heard about the Uyghur oppression in far Western China, where a people is being used for forced labor. They're under terrible oppression and being brought into some supply chains. And one of those supply chains is solar that's produced in China. And so what this really points to is the need to onshore manufacturing for regional economic growth, for jobs, for supply chain integrity, and energy independence, right? And that's what we want to see. That is what our involvement in this space is about, and what we're pushing for. Now, it's important to recognize that there will be areas of the country that are net losers in jobs and others that are net winners, right? And so another thing that we're looking at is how we can invest in companies that are producing new jobs in areas that are losing. And that's what we are doing. And that's why I'm excited. So we're looking at companies, and we're investing in companies that have manufacturing in the US, in the renewable energy supply chain, and in rural areas in particular, right? Areas that are suffering and experiencing some of these job losses. So that's really exciting. In our Business 360 process, we're looking at that hiring locally and expanding regional talent. Super, super important. Now, there's a lot of good news on this front. To 2029, wind service technician is projected to be the fastest growing job in the United States. Number 3, solar installer. So it's good news. There's a lot of job creation on this front. We have to keep that in mind. In fact, if we look in the past, from 2013 to 2018, solar was growing 6 times the national job creation rate. And this is pre-pandemic when our economy was doing pretty well, right? And it was growing 11% CAGR. So new technology, innovation, I talked a little bit about hydrogen, all of these things. When we think about solar on more buildings, those are assets that need to be maintained. We need to get people into the trades and becoming electricians and servicing these assets. Those are the new jobs in this space that are here and growing, right? And so when we think about the shift in technology, there's a lot of opportunity here. And then of course, onshoring is a big thing that we're focused on and looking to be a part of. When we sort of zoom out, I'm going to rate it a neutral because, yeah, there are certain areas like coal where job losses will be experienced, but there are other areas where there'll be rapidly gained. And so with both of those things hand in hand, we'll rate it a neutral. All right, so now let's look at the environmental impact, and created sort of a chart here. We have different categories, and then fossil fuels, renewables, and we kind of thumbs up, thumbs down, right? So mining and extraction, kind of both thumbs down. You got to do a lot of that for both of these technologies, right? If you think about fracking and drilling and, to get gas, and right, it's intensive. Coal, you're scraping off mountains to gather the coal, and open surface mining, right? Like, so there's a lot here. And then for renewables, you got to make steel, you got to mine quartz to produce the solar panels, right? Like, there's mining here, and batteries, of course, will contribute to some of that as well. So we'll just say they're both about the same, right? That's what it is. Now, land use, we already talked about that. Fossil fuels are a winner. They take up less land. Oil spills, renewables are a winner. You don't have to worry about that really anymore, especially, once they're running, it's over. And then air pollution. This is important. I'm going to zoom in on this because renewables are a winner here, and this is something we should take seriously. And it's sort of a silent killer. We're a bit used to it, but it's something I want to look at a little bit more. Water pollution. Renewables are a winner here for various reasons. One being, all the fossil fuel power plants take a lot of water. Actually, 40% of the nation's water goes to just cooling down our power plants. Now, a lot of that returns to the original source, but some is lost to, through evaporation, et cetera. So we can get rid of that, and we can get rid of some of the dirty runoff into our rivers and streams through their operation. And then recycling, both are very material intensive. You got a lot of stuff to recycle. One thing to keep in mind with recycling is any material you can recycle. It might take a lot, but you can recycle it. Whereas once you burn coal or gas or oil, it's gone forever, right? So the renewable aspect of renewable energy is important to keep in mind. And then CO2 could have various implications. Renewables don't emit CO2. Which we'll give them a thumbs up there. Now, air pollution. This is big. According to the World Health Organization, leads to over 4 million deaths worldwide. One study had actually 8 million. To kind of put those numbers in perspective, 8 million people die every year from tobacco use. New York City is 8 million people, right? So this is a lot. It's a silent killing. What we're talking about is early onset of like lung cancer, breathing issues, health complications from just breathing in soot and other particulate matter and different things that come out of the exhaust of these power plants. And renewables, right, can help us can help us breathe clean air, and that's important, particularly in developing countries where they're rapidly building out their energy supply right now. And this can help really solve some of that. And so I think if you think about investing in clean energy, if nothing else, you can be a part of reducing pollution related deaths. And I think that's a noble cause. That's something worth investing in and really looking at. All right. So on environmental impact, we're going to rate it a positive. And I just want to point out that this is dynamic, right? This is today. It could change over time. Technology is constantly changing. Innovations are happening in both spaces, in our sort of conventional, traditional fossil fuel world and in our renewable world. But when you step back, we got two positives, two neutrals, and a negative. So overall, we're looking at something that is good. Is it perfect? No. And no power source is perfect. But we're looking at something that is good.
Sorry, I muted you instead of unmuting myself. You'll have to unmute yourself now.
Oh, okay. Am I back?
You're back. You're
All
back.
right, good.
No, this is great. This is a great analysis, and it's important to note. I wish we could have had the infinite amount of footnotes that we had through all of our conversations through this, because a lot of people are asking some of the very questions that we did not cover. For instance, people are mentioning that we might have been overstating the problem of solar panels taking up too much land. People said, hey, you didn't even consider the fact that many rooftops could be used for solar panels, and that wouldn't be like excess land. So buildings could continue operating just the way they are. If we just covered them with solar panels, that would meet a lot of those needs. People are mentioning that. And there are also people that are mentioning, hey, we want to talk about the amount of landfill space that it will take up, whenever solar panels or wind turbines retire, how that's going to do the landfills. We'll save that till the very end with Q&A. Some of those things mentioning, it just kind of highlights how nuanced each one of these evaluations are throughout this, which I appreciate your approach here, Reggie. So I'll let you continue on.
All right, no, that sounds really good, Sean, and very thoughtful questions. So if we go to really sort of the goals of power generation, and how do we think about that here at Eventide? So we invest with a biblical worldview. We recognize that God has given us the earth for our good, right? And he's entrusted to our care. Our priority is human life, right? Is prospering humanity. And we want to enable perpetual human prosperity, right? We need to alter the environment to be fruitful and multiplied. But when we do that, we should look to do that in such a way to reap the benefits for generations to come, right? In ways that can be done continuously. And this is why we're excited about renewable energy, because of its perpetual nature. It's not perfect, but it does have good advantages. And so that's a key foundation in our view here. The other aspect, and this really excites me, because renewables don't require all the infrastructure with some of the conventional sources of power, right? You don't need to build pipes and maybe more expansive road infrastructure and bigger ports, right? Because you can build a solar anywhere or on someone's roof, like we just mentioned. And I actually saw this personally in Malawi, in Southeastern Africa, where someone donated solar and energy storage to a school there. And they were able to now pump water. They had lights for night study, something we might take for granted. And we're able to have science labs, right? And so the ability to implement this technology in that way is super powerful. And so for the 1 billion people in the world that don't have electricity, this is something that will help them get it. And that is just another key piece here to keep in mind. And then last but not least, I think that this is really interesting, but there's this trend happening in the US right now and around the world where people are putting solar panels on their roofs and sometimes batteries attached to it. And ultimately, it's the democratization of energy. So the sort of home of the future, right? Solar, batteries, and what it's going to do is enable families and households to control their own power, right? They're not going to be dependent on the utility grid. They could go completely off the grid, potentially an island, and form what's called an island, and just be self-sufficient that way, but still have the grid for backup if they need it. And I think having more options for consumers is a good thing. And being able to be energy independent at a local level and control your own power, that's a good thing. And so that's something else that we're seeing with this technology. And now for investors, super important here, This is big. $10 trillion investment opportunity. So this is the global build out of renewables that I showed earlier. $10 trillion for wind and solar. All right, and that's the lion's share of investment in our power infrastructure going forward. There's there's a little, almost nothing for oil relative. There is some for gas. But you can see this is really the big investment opportunity. And if you're skeptical, I want to point you to this. This is a projection from ExxonMobil, and this is only to 2040. What I'm showing you here is to 2050. And what this shows is the energy source growth rate to 2040. So for oil, they're saying 6% per year growth. And then for gas, they're saying 1.3% per year growth. So a little bit under maybe nominal GDP growth. And then you go to wind and solar, 6.7% annual growth. Yes, proportionally, they're saying it's still going to be relatively small compared to all of our energy sources, but it's the fastest growing by far. So even ExxonMobil, in their most sort of conservative view of the world that is out there, is saying, yeah, they're going to grow the fastest, right? So we think it's a compelling opportunity for investors. And that is all I have for you, Sean.
Reggie, thank you. I know for sure that we did not answer everybody's questions. There are nuances to every one of these things. Every data point you have, people have footnotes on, but I thought you explained things very well. It set up categories for discussion very well. And I think this is all very helpful. I know I've learned a lot through this process with you. So we do have some questions that I'll ask, and I'll try to keep it brief because we have about 7 minutes until the hour. So I'm trying to group multiple questions together and ask pertinent ones. So I've heard the claim that we are at our maximum limits for converting solar and wind energy, and that there's not a possibility to exceed these limits. So what do you say about this claim? Like our whole hope that we will be able to convert more solar and wind energy? There are some people that say, no, we're at those limits, and so we can't expect that. Well, is that valid?
Well, so there's a couple things to keep in mind. For solar, you might have heard maybe it's 33% or so. I mean, that's for a single PN junction. In the lab, we've gotten higher efficiencies with, for example, putting 2 PN junctions or 2 units on top of each other to keep it very simple. And so it's not cost effective. It's not able to be scaled at this point. But the more important point is right now for solar panels, we're between about 15 to 20% for efficiency. And so even if the max is only, let's say 33%, and let's say we only get to 25%, right? That is 25% more than we're getting today, which means go back to that cost curve, we get that much more cheaper, right? And that is super significant. The economics for solar just blow, it just gets so phenomenally good, right? So we actually only need incremental improvement. So that's important to keep in mind.
All right, so a couple of these things you addressed in your presentation, I think people want more clarity here. So you addressed intermittency in your presentation, but can you speak directly to the argument? I've actually heard it shaped this way before. So the world's largest battery factory, which is built by Tesla, it would take 500 years to produce enough batteries to store 1 day's worth of electricity, which seems like an overwhelming argument to say, well, what do you have to say about that? Does that present a problem for intermittency?
So it's a great question. And I actually did the math and verified that that is correct. The math is correct if we needed to store 1 day's worth, but we would never do that. And we would never have to sort of store 1 day's worth using lithium-ion batteries, right? And that's where we have to remember, we still need natural gas when solar and wind plus 4 hours or so of storage can't deliver. We still need the natural gas. And this is why we still need the natural gas. That should be the main takeaway. And then we're looking for innovation to provide longer duration storage. And, we go back to the economics. If it doesn't economically make sense, we don't do it.
Great. And I think you might have said this, but it might not have came clear on the ExxonMobil projections. you mentioned that oil was going to grow. I think some people heard 6%, but it's actually 0.6%.
0.6%.
Yeah, 0.6%. So clarification there. So again, you address this in the environmental impact section of the presentation, but there's a common argument concerning the amount of non-renewable materials that it takes to manufacture the components of wind turbines and solar panels. Can you speak to this argument and the problem that it presents?
Yeah, so we definitely need more materials for power in sort of the abstract sense, right? Like concrete, glass, steel, like those are things that you need to build solar and wind. But non-renewable doesn't mean non-recyclable or non-reusable. I mean, we can recycle steel, and we do that quite a bit. And so for wind turbines, you're talking mostly about a steel machine. There's some innovations taking place in recycling the turbine, the composite material that's used for the actual turbine part, but that is sort of frontier that's still being developed, and so I think investment opportunity is what that should scream. And then for same thing for solar, right? We're looking at ways to recycle the components of solar, but once again, you burn fossil fuels, they're gone forever. You make your power with materials, you can work on recycling those materials and using them again. It's not gone forever.
Great. And I think it comes down to a lot of the arguments that are presented really from both sides, because I know it was a common fallacy maybe 20, 25 years ago against the fossil fuel industry to say, hey, there's no way we're going to find any more oil. We're going to run out by, 1998 or whatever the date is. And they're just banking on the fact of like what we know now is the only scenario that we will ever see in the future. Little did they know that, we had other pockets of oil that we had not discovered yet. And a lot of those same common arguments are being placed against renewables in a lot of ways. It's saying, well, hey, we are at maximum capacity for what we're able to do in this area. Battery storage can get no better. Our conversion rate from the sun to usable energy is at its limits. And those arguments are valid at the present time. And I guess as investors, we have to look for where the most valid arguments are for future innovation and what's going to get us ultimately to these goals that we have with our energy, because we need abundant, affordable, reliable energy. And it's looking at the spaces saying, where is there the most room for innovation to get us there? And I think that that's what this presentation does most for me, is not to present a flawless argument for clean and renewable energy, but to say, man, there's a lot of room for innovation here and a lot of room for investment in those innovations. So Reggie, thank you very much for joining us. I do want to advise everybody on this call, we have another webinar event coming up. It is our Discover Values-Based Investing event. You can find out more information on that at go.eventideinvestments.com/discover. Again, go.eventideinvestments.com/discover. Thank you very much for joining this presentation. If you have any more questions for us, you can email us at info@eventidefunds.com. Thank you very much. You may now sign off the line.